My name's Tom Waters. I'm a senior research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. It's tended to be lower earners who have been more directly affected by the pandemic. They've been more likely to lose their jobs, certainly, and younger workers in particular have been more likely to be furloughed because they're more, tend to work in restaurants or retail, things like that. When we look at people's spending and saving over the pandemic, it's certainly true that richer households have been much more likely to really pare back on spending, and that kind of makes sense if you think about the areas that have been shut down. Things like restaurants, for example, or travel tend to be areas which richer households put more of their budget into, and so there's been quite a lot of saving actually when we look at richer households, whereas amongst poorer households have been more likely to go into debt or to draw down on existing savings. And so those kinds of consequences are the kind of things that might have a bit of an overhang of the pandemic into the future. Even once we're fully recovered, that run-up debt might take a while to pay back. In the case of universal credit, government have expanded, done this £20 a week expansion during the pandemic. That's going on for another 6 months. And what's really worth keeping in mind here is that it's not a small number of families that we're talking about here. It's something like 1 in 4 working age families are on universal credit or its predecessors. And so what the government's plans are with this really does make a big difference to a lot of people. It's particularly important for those without children and who are single. That £20 a week tends to be a larger share of their budget, of their benefit, than for other families, and so can mean as much as a 20% decline in their week-to-week income. When we look at those who have started claiming benefits since the beginning of the pandemic, one thing that is notable is they do look quite unlike the kind of standard stock of benefit claimants. So they're likely to be younger, they're actually more likely to have a degree, have worked in a skilled occupation before, also more likely to be single without kids. That's a particularly big difference. You normally think of the benefit system as supporting families with kids to a very large extent. And so it's certainly going to be the case that a large number of people have come into contact with the benefit system or survived on a low income who won't have had that experience before, and whether that kind of changes attitudes towards poverty and the benefit system will be certainly something to kind of keep an eye on going forward. When we look at absolute poverty over the past decade, there hasn't been an enormous amount of change in terms of the overall headline measure, and that's quite notable precisely because we normally see absolute measure of poverty fall over time as people's incomes rise and so on. So that, in that sense, the last decade has been a bit of an outlier. And so the pandemic, and to the extent to which it's actually made things harder for poorer families, that might push poverty rates up. The past decade, it's departments like justice, local government, the welfare budget. Those have been the ones that have tended to be squeezed. Whether the government chooses to look at those again is yet to be seen, but that might be another way in which the pandemic kind of exacerbates or continues those trends.
Wonderful.